My name is Nora Ellis, and I was 29 years old when my husband's family stood in a marble dining room and called me a gold digger in front of my newborn son. They did not whisper it. They did not hint at it. They said it like a verdict. My mother-in-law, Vivian Hart, stood at the head of the table with her pearls shining against her black dress and said, "You planned this from the beginning." My brother-in-law, Preston, leaned back in his chair and smiled like he had been waiting months for permission to be cruel. And my husband's aunt, Margaret, looked down at the baby sleeping in my arms and said, "The child may not even be Caleb's." That was the moment the room went silent. Not because they were ashamed, because they were watching my face. They wanted tears. They wanted to panic. They wanted me to beg them to believe me. But I had already learned something about rich families. When they want to take something from you, they do not start with your money. They start with your dignity. So I held my son closer, looked Vivian Hart straight in the eye, and said, "Order the DNA test." Her smile faded. Because she expected fear, she did not expect consent. 3 weeks later, the DNA results arrived. And by the time everyone finished reading them, the Hart family was not looking at me like a gold digger anymore. They were looking at each other. Because the test did not only prove who my son was, it proved who Preston was not. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand why they hated me so much, you need to understand the kind of woman they thought I was, and the kind of woman I had to become. I met Caleb Hart in the emergency waiting room of St. Anne's Hospital on a night when rain was hitting the windows so hard the glass looked like it was shaking. I was working a double shift. My hair was tied back badly. There was coffee on my sleeve. My feet hurt so much I had started bargaining with God for a chair. Caleb came in holding a blood-soaked towel around his left hand. Before you imagine something dramatic, it was not. He had cut himself trying to fix a broken cabinet hinge at one of the community houses his foundation supported. That was Caleb. He had more money than most people in the city and still tried to fix cabinets himself because, as he later told me, it feels embarrassing to call a contractor for a screw I can see. He was 34 then. Kind eyes, quiet voice, the kind of man who apologized to nurses for needing help. When I called his name, he stood too quickly and almost dropped his phone. "Sorry," he said. "For standing? For bleeding on the chair?" I looked at the chair. There was one small red dot. I said, "I've seen worse." He smiled. Not the polished smile rich men use in charity photos. A tired, human smile. While I cleaned the cut, he asked me about my shift, not himself. He noticed the coffee stain and said it looked like the coffee had lost the fight. He made me laugh at the end of a 12-hour day, which felt almost suspicious. When I saw his last name on the chart, I understood who he was. Caleb Hart, youngest son of the Hart family. The Harts owned Hartwell Properties, one of the largest real estate development companies in the state. Their name was on office towers, hospitals, school buildings, luxury apartments, and old money gossip columns. In my world, the Hart name meant donors' plaques and charity galas. In his world, it meant expectations. He did not act like a Hart that night. He acted like a man who hated being noticed. When the doctor finished stitching his hand, he returned to the nurse station with 2 vending machine coffees, one for himself, one for me. "You shouldn't buy coffee for hospital staff," I said. "Is that a rule?" "No, it's just usually a trap." He blinked. "A trap? People bring nurses coffee when they want special treatment." He looked genuinely horrified. "Oh, no, I just thought you looked like you might collapse." "That sounds worse." He laughed quietly. "Then I will leave the coffee here and walk away before I offend healthcare workers further." He did, but he left his number written on the receipt. I threw it away, then dug it out of the trash 30 minutes later. That was the least dignified beginning of my love story. For 2 weeks, I did not text him. Not because I was playing hard to get, because men like Caleb Hart did not belong in lives like mine. I grew up in a small rental house near the train tracks. My mother cleaned offices at night. My father left when I was 11, taking our old car and most of my mother's trust with him. I started working at 16. By 29, I had a nursing license, student loans, a used car that sounded angry in winter, and a habit of checking price tags before touching anything in a store. I knew how people looked at women like me when we stepped too close to men like Caleb, like calculation, like hunger, like we had studied wealthy families the way hunters study trails. I wanted none of that. But Caleb texted first, not in a pushy way. He sent one message 3 days after the hospital visit. "This is Caleb with the injured hand. I wanted to say thank you again. Also, the cabinet won." I smiled at my phone against my better judgment. I replied, "Cabinets usually do." That became the first of many messages. He was funny in a dry way. He asked questions and remembered answers. He never sent flowers to the hospital, which I appreciated, because nothing makes coworkers suspicious faster than flowers from a rich man. Our first real date was not fancy. He asked where I liked to eat after long shifts. I said a 24-hour diner called Mabel's because they made pancakes at midnight and never judged people in scrubs. He showed up in jeans, a gray sweater, and a nervous expression. I expected awkwardness. I expected him to talk about investments, trips, wine, things I could not relate to. Instead, he asked about patients without asking for private details. He told me about his father, Howard Hart, who had died 3 years earlier, and how the family company had become colder after that. He talked about his older brother Preston, who wanted expansion at any cost, and his mother Vivian, who believed feelings were something poor people used to excuse failure. I told him about my mother. Her name was Nora Ellis. She had hands rough from cleaning chemicals and a laugh that filled rooms too small for it. She raised me with no safety net and more pride than money. She used to say, "Nora, never be ashamed of what work puts on your hands." Caleb listened like the answer mattered. That is how I fell in love with him. Not all at once. Not because he was rich. Because he listened like I was real. The first time I met his family, I understood immediately that they did not see me that way. It was Sunday lunch at the Hart estate. The house sat behind black iron gates, all white stone, trimmed hedges, and windows tall enough to make ordinary people feel shorter. I wore my best navy dress. I had bought it on sale and steamed it twice. Caleb squeezed my hand before we walked in. "You don't have to impress them," he whispered. "That's easy to say when your mother owns a staircase that curves." He laughed, but his hand was tense. Vivian Hart greeted me in the foyer. She was elegant in a way that felt sharpened. Silver blonde hair, perfect posture, cream silk blouse, pearls, eyes that measured everything and approved of very little. "Nora," she said, taking my hand lightly. "Caleb has told us so much." Not a warm sentence, a warning. Preston stood near the fireplace with a drink in his hand. He was taller than Caleb, broader, louder. He had their father's square jaw and Vivian's cold eyes. "So you're the nurse," he said. "Not nice to meet you. Not Caleb has mentioned you." "The nurse." I smiled. "Yes, useful profession." Caleb's jaw tightened. I squeezed his hand once. Lunch was worse. Vivian asked where I grew up. When I answered, she said, "Oh," in a tone that made the entire neighborhood sound like a disease. Aunt Margaret asked if nursing paid enough these days. Preston asked if I planned to continue working if Caleb and I became serious. I said yes. He smiled. "Good. Ambition is important." The way he said ambition made it clear he thought mine had a target. Caleb defended me more than once, but each defense seemed to make them dislike me more. After lunch, Vivian cornered me near the patio doors. She held a teacup so delicate it looked decorative. "My son is very generous," she said. "I know. Generous men attract people who need generosity." I looked at her. There it was, not even hidden. I could have pretended not to understand. Instead, I said, "I pay my own rent, Mrs. Hart." Her smile barely moved. For now. When I told Caleb later, he was furious. "I'll talk to her." "No, Nora, no. If you talk to her every time she insults me, she will say I manipulate you." His face fell because he knew I was right. That became the pattern. His family insulted me politely. I survived politely. Caleb got angry privately. Vivian never yelled. Preston never threatened. Margaret never said anything directly cruel enough to quote without sounding sensitive. But I felt it every time. The pause when I entered a room, the glance at my shoes, the way Vivian said, "Your hospital work," like I was doing a temporary hobby among the unfortunate. The way Preston asked Caleb whether he had reviewed the trust structure after we had been dating 6 months. The first time the words gold digger reached me, they came through someone else. Caleb and I were attending a charity dinner for the children's wing at St. Anne's. He had donated quietly, without wanting a speech. Vivian had donated publicly, with her name on the invitation. I was in the restroom when two women entered, laughing softly. One said, "That's Caleb's girlfriend?" The other replied, "Yes, Vivian must be dying. I heard she's a nurse." "Well, that tracks." They laughed. Then one said, "At least she chose the softer brother. Preston would have spotted a gold digger faster." I stood inside the stall, hands cold, listening to them fix their lipstick and walk out. When I returned to the table, Caleb noticed immediately. "What happened?" "Nothing." He looked at me for a long time, then placed his hand over mine under the table. I wanted to tell him. I almost did, but I had learned something in the heart world. If you repeated cruelty, people judged how calmly you repeated it before deciding whether it counted. So I swallowed it. Not because I was weak, because I was tired. Caleb proposed 1 year after we met. Not at a gala, not under fireworks. At Mabel's diner after a night shift, with pancakes between us and rain tapping on the window. He slid the ring box across the table and looked so nervous, I almost laughed before crying. "I know my family is difficult," he said. "That is a generous word. I know they've hurt you." I looked down. "I don't want you to spend your life being hurt because of me." He reached across the table. "Nora, I don't want a life where loving you is negotiable." That was the sentence that made me say yes. The ring was beautiful, too beautiful. I told him it was too much. He said, "It was my grandmother's. My father gave it to me before he died and told me to give it to someone who made the world feel honest." I cried again, a lot. The waitress brought extra napkins and pretended not to watch. When we told his family, Vivian stared at the ring first. Not at my face, at the ring. Then she said, "How sudden." We had dated a year. Preston laughed once. "That was fast." Aunt Margaret said, "Well, congratulations, dear." Dear, like I was a waitress who brought the wrong soup. Caleb said, "We're happy." Vivian lifted her eyes to him. "I hope happiness is enough." It was not a blessing. It was a prediction. The months before the wedding were a war disguised as planning. Vivian wanted a prenuptial agreement. I agreed. That surprised everyone. Preston looked almost disappointed. The agreement was fair. Caleb made sure of that. I did not want his family's money. I did not want their company. I did not want anything that could be used later as proof of greed. I kept working at the hospital. I paid my own bills. When Vivian suggested the Hart family cover my mother's dress and travel, I declined. When Margaret offered to help refine my guest list, meaning cut my side smaller, I declined. When Preston joked that I was the only bride he knew who didn't want to upgrade everything, I said, "Maybe I know the difference between a wedding and a purchase." He did not laugh. The wedding was small compared to Hart standards, and large compared to mine. My mother cried through most of it. Caleb cried when I walked down the aisle, which made Vivian look away like emotion was embarrassing. During the reception, Preston gave a toast. It was polished, funny, cruel if you knew how to listen. He said Caleb had always followed his heart, sometimes before checking the numbers. People laughed. He said marriage was about trust, especially when two people come from very different worlds. More laughter. Then he raised his glass to unexpected investments. Caleb nearly stood. I touched his arm. "Don't," I whispered. Everyone heard that. "Yes," I said. And they also saw us not flinch. That was how I survived the Harts, one insult at a time, without flinching. For the first year of marriage, Caleb and I were happy in a way that felt almost rebellious. We lived in a house he already owned, but we made it ours slowly, not with expensive decorators, with books, plants, mismatched mugs, and weekend breakfasts. I kept working. Caleb kept pushing his family company toward affordable housing projects, which Preston hated because profits were lower and praise was less immediate. Vivian visited too often. She would walk into our kitchen and notice small things. "You still use this old kettle? You keep your work shoes near the door? Caleb, darling, you look tired. Are you sleeping enough?" Translation: Nora is not taking proper care of you. I learned to smile without inviting discussion. Then I got pregnant. Caleb was stunned at first, then so happy he had to sit down. He placed both hands over his face and laughed like a boy. "We're having a baby? That is what the test strongly suggests." He cried. I cried. Then we ordered pancakes from Mabel's, because some traditions deserve respect. For a few weeks, we kept the news private. Those weeks were golden. Caleb talked to my stomach when he thought I was asleep. He read baby name lists aloud, like he was negotiating a treaty. He built the crib himself, slowly, carefully, with only 3 minor injuries. Then we told his family. Vivian's first reaction was silence, then a smile, not joy, calculation. How far along? 10 weeks, Caleb said. Preston looked at me, then at him. That was quick. Caleb's voice cooled. We've been married a year, Margaret said. Babies do change everything. Vivian placed a hand over her pearls. They certainly do. After that, the cruelty changed shape. Before, they treated me like a temporary mistake. Now they treated me like a permanent threat. Vivian began asking about doctors, records, schedules. Preston started suggesting Caleb review inheritance plans. Margaret made comments about modern women and security. One afternoon, Vivian visited while Caleb was at work. I was folding baby clothes in the nursery. She stood in the doorway. You must be very relieved. I looked up. About what? She smiled. Having a child does create stability. I set down the tiny blue shirt in my hands. If you mean I got pregnant to secure money, say it plainly. Her eyes sharpened. I did not say that. You never do. She stepped into the room. Caleb is trusting. His father was the same. He believed love made people better than they are. I stood. I love your son. I'm sure you love many things about his life. There it was. I felt the baby move for the first time that week. A flutter. Small. Real. And suddenly I was too angry to be polite. Get out of my house. Vivian blinked. It may have been the first time anyone had said those exact words to her. This is Caleb's house. It is our home. And you are not welcome in it when you insult me. Her face hardened. You will regret making an enemy of me. No, Vivian, I said. You made that choice long before I responded. She left. That evening, Caleb called her and told her she would not visit without asking again. She cried to him. Of course she did. She said I had misunderstood. She said pregnancy made women emotional. She said she was only concerned for him. Caleb listened, then said, Mom, stop. 2 words. Calm. Final. It was the first time I heard him speak to her like that. For a while, things quieted. Not because they accepted me, because they waited. Our son was born on a cold morning in November. We named him Eli Hart. He had Caleb's dark hair and my mouth and the tiniest fingers I had ever seen. When the nurse placed him on my chest, everything else disappeared. The Hart name, the money, Vivian, Preston, all of it. There was only this little person blinking at the world like he was unimpressed by the lighting. Caleb stood beside me, crying openly. He's perfect, he whispered. He looks angry, I whispered back. Then he's yours. I laughed and cried at the same time. For 2 days, we were just a family. Then the Harts arrived. Vivian wore cream, as if even hospitals needed her elegance. Preston brought flowers bigger than necessary. Margaret carried a gift bag and a face full of judgment. Vivian looked at Eli in my arms. For 1 second, something almost soft crossed her face. Then Preston said, He doesn't look much like Caleb. The room chilled. Caleb turned slowly. What did you say? Preston shrugged. Just an observation. I held Eli closer. He is 2 days old. Margaret peered in. Babies change, of course. Vivian said nothing. That was worse. Caleb stepped between them and the bed. You can leave. Vivian looked wounded. Caleb. Now. They left. But the sentence stayed. He doesn't look much like Caleb. It spread through the family faster than illness. By the time Eli was 3 weeks old, I knew. Not because anyone told me directly, because invitations stopped. Calls changed. Vivian asked Caleb to come alone to discuss family matters. Preston stopped pretending in text messages. Margaret sent a christening gown from the Hart side with a note that said, if appropriate. If appropriate. I wanted to throw it away. Caleb did. That made me love him even more. But stress began eating at him. He was fighting his family at work and at home. Preston wanted Caleb removed from several company projects. Vivian wanted a review of trust documents. Lawyers began appearing in conversations. Then came the dinner that changed everything. Vivian requested it formally, not a casual family meal, a family meeting. Caleb almost refused. I told him we should go. Why? He asked. Because they are building a story in rooms where we are not present. He looked exhausted. You shouldn't have to defend yourself. I know, but I will. The Hart dining room looked like a museum of expensive silence. Long table, crystal glasses, portraits on the walls, a chandelier bright enough to interrogate the living. I arrived wearing a simple black dress. Caleb carried Eli's diaper bag. I carried Eli. That mattered to me. If they wanted to discuss my son, they would look at him while they did it. Vivian sat at the head of the table. Preston sat to her right. Margaret to her left. Two family attorneys sat farther down. Caleb stopped in the doorway. Lawyers? Vivian folded her hands. This protects everyone. I almost laughed. That sentence usually means someone is about to attack. We sat. No food was served. That told me everything. Vivian began. Nora, there are concerns. I looked at her. About? Preston leaned forward. Don't play innocent. Caleb's voice was low. Careful. Preston ignored him. The timing of the pregnancy, your background, the pressure on family assets. There are questions. I looked around the table. Margaret avoided my eyes. The lawyers watched their papers. Vivian looked directly at me. We believe a DNA test is necessary before any changes are made regarding trusts, inheritance, or family recognition. Family recognition. As if Eli needed a committee to exist. Caleb stood so fast the chair hit the floor behind him. You don't get to question my son. Preston stood too. Maybe if you had questioned more, we wouldn't be here. Vivian's voice cut through the room. Sit down, Caleb. He did not. I placed one hand on his arm. Caleb. He looked at me, furious and hurt. I shook my head once, not because I wanted him quiet, because I wanted them exposed. I turned to Vivian. Say what you mean. Her eyes narrowed. I beg your pardon? You invited lawyers. You implied my child may not belong in this family. Say it plainly. Vivian's chin lifted. Fine. We believe you may have targeted Caleb for money, rushed the pregnancy for security, and we are not convinced the child is his. There it was, the ugly truth finally without perfume. Caleb whispered, Mom, not angry now, broken. That broke my heart more than the insult, because somewhere inside him, the little boy still wanted his mother to be better. I knew that feeling too. Preston leaned back, satisfied. There, now it's said. Margaret murmured, It is better to be certain. I looked down at Eli. He was asleep, tiny mouth open. Completely unaware that strangers with his bloodline were trying to turn him into evidence, something inside me went very still, cold, clear. I looked back at Vivian. Order the DNA test. Silence. Preston's smile faltered. Vivian blinked. Caleb turned toward me. Nora, no. We don't have to. Yes, I said quietly. We do. Vivian studied me. You agree? I insist. The room shifted. They had expected me to cry, to refuse, to look guilty, but innocent people can still be terrified, and I refused to let my fear serve their story. I looked at the attorneys. Use a certified lab, full chain of custody, Caleb, Eli, and me if needed. One attorney cleared his throat. That can be arranged. I looked at Vivian again, and when the results come, we read them together. Her face tightened. Of course. No, I said. Not privately, not through whispers. Together, in this room. Preston laughed. You're very confident. I looked at him. No, Preston. I'm very tired. That night, Caleb apologized until his voice cracked. I told him to stop. He said, I should have protected you from this. I said, You stood up. I didn't stop it. I looked at our son sleeping between us. Then we stop it with truth. The test was done 2 days later. Cheek swabs, paperwork, signatures. A nurse I knew avoided my eyes because she understood enough to feel sorry for me. I hated that. I did not want pity. I wanted the results. The 3 weeks waiting for them were some of the longest of my life. Caleb barely slept. I kept having nightmares that the papers disappeared, that Vivian altered something, that Preston found a way to twist the truth before it arrived. I knew Eli was Caleb's son. Of course I knew. But being falsely accused does something strange to your body. Logic says you are safe. Fear says rich people do not need truth if they own enough rooms where truth is decided. So I documented everything, every message, every call, every insult, every legal request. I made copies. I kept notes. When you are a woman, people want to call greedy. You learn to build a paper trail around your own dignity. The results came on a Thursday. Vivian called the meeting for Friday morning. Same dining room, Same chandelier, same long table. This time, Caleb held Eli. I carried a folder. Vivian sat pale and rigid. Preston looked confident, but his fingers tapped the table. Margaret whispered prayers under her breath, though I suspected they were mostly for the family reputation. The lab report was sealed. The attorney opened it in front of everyone. He read silently first. His expression changed. That was the first sign, Vivian noticed. What is it? The attorney cleared his throat. The test confirms Caleb Hart is the biological father of Eli Hart, with a probability greater than 99.99%. The room went silent, not with shock, with collapse. Caleb closed his eyes and pressed his forehead to Eli's tiny head. I did not move. Vivian stared at the paper. Preston's jaw tightened. Margaret whispered, "Thank God." I almost laughed. God had not been the one making accusations at dinner. Caleb looked at his mother. "You questioned my son." Vivian's mouth trembled. "Caleb, You questioned my wife, Nora. No," I said. My voice was calm. That seemed to scare her more. "You don't get to move from accusation to apology without walking through what you did." Preston stood. "Fine. The child is his. Are we done?" The attorney looked uncomfortable. "Not exactly." Every eye turned to him. He looked at the papers again. "There is an additional issue." Vivian frowned. "What issue?" The attorney swallowed. "The lab ran the family comparison panel requested by Mr. Preston Hart's counsel." Caleb looked confused. "What panel?" Preston's face changed. "Just slightly, but I saw it." The attorney continued. "The results confirm Eli's paternity. However, the comparative markers raise a discrepancy regarding the presumed sibling relationship between Caleb Hart and Preston Hart." The room became so quiet, I could hear Eli breathing. Vivian whispered, "What does that mean?" The attorney looked like he wished the floor would open. "It means the test results are not consistent with Caleb Hart and Preston Hart being full biological siblings." Preston shot to his feet. "That's impossible." The attorney held up a hand. "This is not a dedicated paternity test for Mr. Preston Hart, but the markers are significant enough that the lab flagged the relationship assumption." Caleb stared at Preston, then at Vivian. Vivian's face had gone white, not surprised, terrified, and that was when everyone understood. The DNA test they demanded to expose me had opened a door in their own house, and behind that door was Vivian's secret. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The Hart dining room, which had survived decades of cold meals and colder conversations, finally met a silence too heavy for its walls. Preston stood with both hands on the table, breathing hard. "This is wrong," the attorney said carefully. "As I said, this is not a direct test regarding you. It only indicates—" "I said it's wrong." His voice cracked on the last word. That crack mattered. Preston Hart never cracked. He commanded, mocked, smiled, threatened through lawyers. But in that moment, he sounded like a boy whose floor had disappeared. Caleb looked at Vivian. "Mom?" Vivian did not answer. She stared at the DNA report as if the paper itself had betrayed her. I had seen Vivian angry. I had seen her smug. I had seen her pretending to be wounded. But I had never seen her afraid like that. Caleb's voice dropped. "Mom, what does this mean?" Margaret slowly lowered herself into a chair. "Oh, Vivian," she whispered. That whisper told me this was not completely unknown to everyone. Maybe suspected, maybe buried, but not unimaginable. Preston turned toward Margaret. "What does that mean?" Margaret covered her mouth. Vivian finally spoke. "Everyone calm down." Caleb gave a bitter laugh. "You accused my wife of carrying another man's child." Vivian flinched. "You brought lawyers to question my son's blood. Nobody knew the lab would—" "And now you want calm?" Preston pointed at the attorney. "I want a proper test. Now." The attorney nodded quickly. "That can be arranged." "No," Vivian said. The word came out sharp, too sharp. Every eye turned to her. Preston stared. "Why not?" Vivian lifted her chin, the queen returning to her throne. "Because this family has already been humiliated enough." I almost admired the speed. In less than a minute, she had moved from accusing my newborn to protecting family dignity. Caleb looked at her like he no longer recognized the woman who raised him. "Humiliated?" he said. "That's what you call this?" Vivian looked at me then, and there it was. Blame, not apology, not shame, blame, as if I had somehow caused the test to speak, as if my innocence had been rude. "This meeting is over," she said. I stood. "No, it isn't." Her eyes narrowed. "You have your result." "Yes," I said. "And you have yours." Preston turned on me. "Shut your mouth." Caleb moved instantly. "Do not speak to her that way." Preston laughed, but it sounded broken. "What? Now you're suddenly brave because your nurse passed the test?" Caleb handed Eli to me carefully. Then he stepped toward his brother. No shouting, no drama, just quiet fury. "You do not get to call her that again." Preston looked like he wanted to swing, but he did not. Because despite all his arrogance, Preston was still a man trained to understand optics. A fight in front of lawyers, after a DNA report like that, would not help him. Vivian stood too. "Enough," I looked at her. "You wanted certainty. Now you have it. My son is Caleb's. I am not the liar in this room." Her face tightened. That sentence hit its target. Caleb turned to the attorney. "We want copies of everything." "Caleb," Vivian said. He did not look at her. "Everything." The attorney nodded. We left without another word. Outside, the air felt too bright. I stood on the stone steps with Eli against my chest, while Caleb walked a few feet away, then stopped, bent forward, and placed his hands on his knees like he could not breathe. I went to him. "Caleb." He shook his head. "I'm sorry. You don't have to keep apologizing for them. I brought you into that house. You also walked out with me." He looked at me then. His eyes were wet. "I don't know who my family is." I looked back at the mansion. White stone, perfect windows, rot hidden behind expensive curtains. "I think we're about to find out." The days after the DNA test were chaos. Not public chaos at first. The Harts were too experienced for that. Their chaos began privately, through phone calls, lawyers, emergency meetings, and cold messages written by people trying to sound calm while standing in emotional fire. Preston demanded a direct DNA test. Vivian refused. Then Preston threatened court action regarding inheritance and his position in Hartwell Properties. That was when Vivian changed. Not because she wanted truth, because she wanted control. A dedicated test was arranged. Preston, Vivian, and stored genetic material from Howard Hart, Caleb's late father, through medical records and legally preserved samples from a prior health procedure. It took another 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, Caleb barely spoke to his mother. Preston sent him messages that swung wildly between rage and denial. "This changes nothing. You and your wife planned this. If you think you can take the company, you're insane." Caleb showed me one message late at night. "Did you plan the DNA markers too?" I asked. He almost smiled. Almost. But the pain in him was deep. Because for Caleb, this was not just about Preston. It was about his father. Howard Hart had been gone for years, but Caleb loved him. He talked about him with warmth. Howard had been strict but fair, ambitious but not heartless. He was the one who pushed Caleb toward community housing projects. He was the one who told Caleb that buildings should serve people, not just investors. If Preston was not Howard's son, then the story Caleb knew had been altered long before I entered it. And Vivian had been sitting on that truth while accusing me of betrayal. The direct results came back on a Tuesday. Preston was not Howard Hart's biological son. There are sentences that do not need decoration. That was one of them. Preston Hart, the golden heir, the man who looked at me like I was unworthy of the family name, the man who questioned my newborn son's blood, was not the biological child of the man whose empire he claimed as birthright. The fallout was immediate. Preston disappeared from the office for 3 days. Vivian stayed inside the estate and refused visitors. Margaret called Caleb crying, saying she had suspected something decades ago, but never knew. Caleb listened quietly, then asked, "And you never thought I deserved the truth?" Margaret had no answer. The company board requested a private review. That was when things became bigger than family shame. Howard Hart's will had specific clauses. I learned this from Caleb and the attorneys. Hartwell Properties had voting shares divided between Vivian, Caleb, and Preston, but Preston's inheritance rights had been written under the assumption that he was Howard's legal and biological son. Biology alone did not automatically erase everything, of course. Law is complicated. But the issue opened questions about documents Vivian had signed, representations made to trustees, and whether Howard knew the truth. More importantly, it revealed something Preston had been hiding. While trying to strengthen his claim against Caleb, Preston had recently pushed for changes in trust structures that would have reduced Caleb's voting influence and placed more control in his own hands. His argument had been bloodline continuity. Bloodline. The irony was so sharp it almost cut everyone in the room. Caleb did not celebrate. That is one of the reasons I loved him. He could have used the news cruelly. He could have mocked Preston. He did not. He simply said, "I want the company protected from whatever lies are still inside it." That became our focus. Truth, not revenge. At least, not at first. Vivian requested a private meeting with Caleb. He refused unless I came. She hated that, which meant I went. We met in a small sitting room at the Hart estate, not the dining room. Maybe Vivian wanted a softer setting. Maybe she could no longer stand the table where her own weapon turned around in her hands. She looked older, still elegant, still polished, but the polish had cracks. Caleb sat beside me. Eli was with my mother that afternoon, safely away from the storm. Vivian began without greeting me. "Caleb, this is a private family matter," he said. "Nora is my wife." Vivian's jaw tightened. Some conversations should remain among those who understand the weight of the Hart name. I looked at her. "You mean the name you thought I was trying to steal?" Her eyes flashed. Caleb took my hand. Vivian inhaled slowly. "I was wrong about the child." I waited. That was not an apology. Caleb waited too. Vivian looked between us. "I should not have allowed things to become so harsh." Allowed, as if cruelty was weather. I said, "You created it." Her mouth tightened. "I am trying to speak to my son, and I am the woman you accused." Caleb looked at his mother. "She deserves an apology." Vivian stared at him. For a moment, I thought she would refuse. Then, with visible effort, she turned to me. "I apologize for questioning Eli's paternity. It was stiff, incomplete, but it existed." I said, "You also called me a gold digger." I never used that exact phrase. I almost laughed. "Vivian." She looked away. That was as close as she came. Caleb leaned forward. "Did Dad know?" The room changed. Vivian folded her hands. "Howard and I had difficulties early in the marriage." "That's not what I asked." Her voice sharpened. "You do not understand what my life was like." "Then explain." She looked toward the window. For once, Vivian Hart seemed to search for a truth that would make her look human without making her look guilty. "I was young. Your grandfather controlled everything. Howard was always working. The family expected perfection. I made one mistake before Preston was born. One mistake. A whole person reduced to a mistake." Caleb's face hardened. "Did Dad know?" Vivian's eyes filled, but no tears fell. "I don't know." That answer was worse than yes, because it meant she had lived decades inside uncertainty and built an empire of judgment on top of it. "Did Preston's biological father know?" Caleb asked. Vivian's face closed. "He is gone." "Who was he?" "No one relevant." Caleb stared at her. "Relevant to whom?" She did not answer. I realized then that Vivian was not protecting Preston. She was still protecting herself. Caleb stood. "We're done." Vivian reached for him. "Caleb, please. If this becomes public, everything your father built." "Don't," he said. His voice was low. "Do not use Dad's legacy to hide your lies after you used that same legacy to attack my wife and son." Vivian's hand fell. We left again. This time, she did not call after us. Preston did not stay quiet for long. Men like Preston rarely do. He hired his own legal team and began claiming Vivian had deceived him. Caleb was exploiting the situation, and I had somehow manipulated the DNA process to damage him. That last part almost impressed me. I had been accused of many things in the Hart family, but apparently my talents now included controlling genetics. Preston started leaking selective information, anonymous posts, whispers to business reporters, claims that Caleb was trying to push him out after a family medical issue. He did not mention the original DNA test. He did not mention accusing me. He did not mention Eli, so I kept my folder. Remember what I said earlier? When people call you greedy, build a paper trail around your dignity. I had built one. The dinner invitation, the attorney emails, the DNA chain of custody, the messages Preston sent, the christening gown note, the trust review documents, every insult that had left a digital footprint. Caleb did not want to go public. Neither did I. But Preston began targeting the foundation projects Caleb cared about, telling board members Caleb was unstable and distracted by domestic influence. Domestic influence. That meant me. That was when Caleb changed, not into someone cruel, into someone done. He called a board meeting. Vivian tried to stop it. Preston tried to control it. Caleb walked in with documentation. I was not in the room, but I was nearby with Eli, waiting in a private office because Caleb wanted us close. Later, he told me everything. He presented the facts plainly. His wife and child had been subjected to a DNA test after family members raised paternity accusations. The test confirmed Eli was his son. The same test raised concerns about Preston's biological relation to Howard Hart. A direct test confirmed Preston was not Howard's biological child. Preston had attempted to use bloodline arguments in trust and voting matters while concealing the new information and attacking Caleb's fitness. Then Caleb said one sentence that spread through the company by evening. I will not allow a man who weaponized my son's blood to protect his own lies to control my father's legacy. The board suspended Preston from executive authority pending legal review. Preston exploded, literally, according to Caleb, shouting, threatening, pointing at Vivian, calling Caleb weak, calling me poison. Then he stormed out. For the first time since I entered the Hart family, Preston did not get the last word. But revenge has a way of costing more than people expect. Caleb came home that night exhausted. He sat on the nursery floor while Eli slept in the crib and said, I hate this. I sat beside him. I know. I wanted them to be better. I know. I keep thinking if Dad were alive. He stopped. I finished softly. He would be heartbroken. Caleb nodded, then whispered, but maybe he would finally know the truth. That was the tragedy under everything. The truth came too late for Howard, but not too late for us. For several days after Preston's suspension, Vivian tried to regain control the only way she knew how, through silence. She refused interviews. She refused family calls. She refused company requests unless they came through attorneys. But silence is only powerful when nobody else has documents. And this time, Caleb had documents. I had documents. Preston had anger. Vivian had fear. Those were not equal weapons. One evening, while Caleb reviewed foundation papers at our kitchen table, I sat across from him with Eli asleep against my shoulder. He looked tired enough to disappear. Caleb, I said. He looked up. You don't have to save everything your father built. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I know. Do you? He looked down at the papers. I don't know what part is legacy and what part is prison. That sentence hurt because I understood it. Families can hand you love and chains in the same box. Sometimes it takes years to learn which is which. I said, then keep what protects people and let the rest fall. He looked at me. That simple? No, but maybe simple things are allowed to be hard. He smiled faintly. You sound like your mother. That is the highest compliment available. He reached across the table and touched Eli's tiny foot. I don't want him to grow up thinking love has to prove itself in court. Then we don't teach him that. How? I looked at our son. We believe him before strangers force him to bleed for proof. Caleb closed his eyes. That was the heart of it. Not shares, not wills, not scandal. A child had been questioned by his own family before he could even lift his head, and his father was deciding that cycle ended there. Part 3. The test that exposed them. The story became public because Preston made one final mistake. He sued, not privately, not quietly. He filed a petition challenging the board's suspension and accusing Caleb of manipulation, reputational harm, and improper influence by his spouse. By his spouse. That was me again. Still the outsider. Still the nurse. Still the gold digger in a nicer legal suit. The filing was public. Reporters noticed. Hartwell Properties was too large for family drama to remain hidden once court documents appeared. Within 48 hours, headlines began circling. Hartwell Properties faces internal family dispute. Questions surround Hart heir's suspension. Trust battle emerges inside prominent real estate family. The first articles were vague. Then Preston's side leaked more. Sources close to him suggested Caleb was controlled by his wife. Sources claimed I had pushed Caleb to consolidate power. Sources said my sudden rise inside the family followed the birth of my child. There it was again. Gold digger without the word. A story shaped like a knife. Caleb wanted to shield me. I told him the truth. You can't shield me from a lie by hiding the truth. So Andrea Kim entered our lives. Yes, the same kind of calm, terrifying lawyer every revenge story deserves. She was recommended by a hospital board member who had watched the headlines with growing disgust. Andrea read every document at our kitchen table while Eli slept in a bassinet beside her. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "They built their accusation around your silence." I nodded. Then we removed the silence. A response was filed, detailed, documented, precise. It did not reveal unnecessary medical details, but it revealed enough. It stated that paternity accusations had originated from Preston and Vivian. It confirmed a certified DNA test had proven Caleb's paternity of Eli. It stated that additional family relationship discrepancies had been discovered as a consequence of testing requested by Preston's side. It included evidence that Preston had attempted to alter trust influence while promoting bloodline arguments. It included Preston's messages referring to me as the nurse problem and Caleb's liability. That phrase became public. The nurse problem. People reacted strongly to that. Nurses from St. Anne's were not quiet. Former patients commented. Hospital staff shared stories about me working double shifts, paying for patient transport out of my own pocket once, helping families fill out forms after hours. My mother, who had avoided public attention her entire life, gave one interview outside her church. A reporter asked what she thought of people calling her daughter a gold digger. My mother looked directly into the camera and said, "My daughter was working when those people were still deciding which spoon to use." That clip spread everywhere. I watched it and cried, not because it was polished, because it was my mother, plain, tired, fearless. Vivian hated the publicity. Preston hated losing control of the story. Caleb hated all of it, but he stood firm. The court did not give Preston what he wanted. The board's suspension remained. Trust review continued. And then the biggest blow came not from court, but from Howard Hart himself. His old private journals were found in company archives during document review. Howard kept handwritten notes, not diaries exactly, business reflections, personal thoughts, records of meetings. One entry from the year Preston was born changed everything. It read, "Vivian is distant. The child is innocent. I have chosen to raise him as my son, but truth cannot be allowed to become a weapon against Caleb one day." I read a copy of that entry sitting beside Caleb in our living room. He covered his mouth. Howard had known, at least enough. He had chosen to raise Preston. That part mattered. It meant Preston was not illegitimate in love, only in the lies Vivian built later. But Howard had also feared the truth being weaponized against Caleb. And decades later, that was exactly what had happened. Another document followed, a sealed letter from Howard to the trustees. In it, he clarified that if questions of biological lineage ever arose, no person should use bloodline claims to disinherit, discredit, or overpower Caleb or Caleb's children. He emphasized character, stewardship, and transparency over biology. Howard Hart had protected Caleb from beyond the grave. Vivian had hidden behind his name. Preston had tried to weaponize it, but Howard's own words stopped them. The trust review removed Preston from controlling authority over family voting shares tied to biological succession claims. He retained personal assets Howard had legally given him because Howard had knowingly raised him as a son. That was fair, but he lost the power he had tried to seize through lies. Caleb became primary steward of Howard's foundation-linked shares. Vivian retained wealth, but her influence collapsed. Margaret resigned from the family council after admitting she had suspected the truth and stayed silent. The company board issued a statement about governance changes. The press called it a corporate restructuring, but we knew what it was, a house cleaning. The first time I saw Vivian after all of it, she looked smaller, still elegant, still proud, but smaller. She came to our house alone, no pearls, no attorney, no Preston. I almost did not let her in. Caleb was at the office. Eli was napping. I stood in the doorway and waited. Vivian looked at me for a long moment. "I owe you an apology." "Yes," I said. She flinched. Maybe she expected politeness. I was done giving free politeness to people who spent it badly. She swallowed. "I called you things without saying them plainly. I assumed the worst of you because it was easier than questioning my own house. I said nothing. She continued. I saw your background and believed it made you hungry for what we had. My background made me careful, I said. Your family made me defensive. She nodded slowly. I was cruel. That word mattered. Not mistaken, not protective, cruel. I let the silence hold it. Then she said, May I see Eli? No. Her face tightened, but she accepted it. Not today, I added. Her eyes lifted. That tiny mercy cost me something, but it was mine to give. Thank you, she whispered. I did not forgive her that day. Forgiveness is not a door people get to open from the outside. But I stopped needing her to suffer for me to feel safe. That was its own kind of release. Preston never apologized. That will surprise no one. He moved to another city after resigning from Hartwell Properties. For months, he gave interviews through sources about betrayal and family politics. Nobody listened for long. Men like Preston mistake attention for respect. Once the attention faded, so did most of his power. 2 years later, I saw him once at a legal event. He looked at me from across the room. For a second, I saw the old smirk try to return. It failed. He looked away first. That was enough. Caleb changed too. The pain did not disappear, but he became more certain. He expanded the foundation's affordable housing work. He created policies requiring board transparency and independent ethics review. He named one project after his father, but not in the flashy way Vivian would have liked. The Howard Hart Community Homes opened on the east side of the city, where rent had pushed working families out for years. At the opening ceremony, Caleb spoke with Eli on his hip. Our son was 2 then, serious-eyed, still unimpressed by microphones. Caleb said, My father believed buildings should protect dignity. We forgot that for a while. We are remembering now. He looked at me when he said it. Not because I saved him. I did not. But because I had stood beside him while truth burned down what needed burning. After the ceremony, a reporter asked me how it felt to be vindicated after being accused of marrying for money. I could have given a dramatic answer. I could have said karma. I could have said justice. Instead, I said, it feels like I wish people had believed the truth before a test had to prove it. That became the line people quoted. But the fuller truth was more complicated. Yes, the DNA test cleared my name. Yes, it exposed Vivian's secret. Yes, it destroyed Preston's attempt to take control. Yes, the people who called me a gold digger had to watch the world learn what they were hiding. But the test did not tell the whole truth. DNA proved Eli was Caleb's son. It proved Preston was not Howard's biological son. But it did not prove my love. It did not prove my loyalty. It did not prove the nights I held Caleb while his family broke his heart. It did not prove the years I worked until my feet hurt. It did not prove my mother's sacrifices. It did not prove I was worthy. Because worth is not something a lab can measure. That was the lesson I carried. The Hart family had worshipped bloodline until bloodline embarrassed them. They had worshipped wealth until wealth could not protect them. They had worshipped reputation until truth became louder. And me? I had spent too long wanting people like Vivian to look at me and see I was not what they called me. Now I no longer needed her eyes. I had my own. One evening, years after the test, Caleb and I took Eli to Mabel's Diner, the same place where Caleb proposed. Eli was old enough to demand pancakes for dinner and negotiate syrup like a tiny attorney. Caleb looked across the booth at me and smiled. What? I asked. He shook his head. Just thinking. Dangerous. Very. He reached for my hand. I'm sorry it took a DNA test for them to see what I already knew. I squeezed his fingers. They still didn't see everything. No, he said. But I did. Outside, rain tapped against the diner windows. Not heavy, not cruel, just rain. I thought about the night in Vivian's dining room when she called me a gold digger without needing to use the words. I thought about Preston leaning back, confident that truth belonged to whoever had more lawyers. I thought about the attorney reading the result. Caleb Hart is the biological father, then the second truth. Preston Hart is not consistent as a full biological sibling. A test meant to throw me out had opened their locked room instead. People often ask if I am grateful for that DNA test. I am not grateful for being humiliated. I am not grateful my newborn son was treated like a question mark. I am not grateful that my husband had to learn his family's love came with conditions and footnotes. But I am grateful the truth survived the room built to crush it. I am grateful I said yes when they expected fear. I am grateful I kept records. I am grateful Caleb chose us. And I am grateful my son will grow up knowing that his mother did not beg cruel people to believe her. She stood still. She held him close. And she let the truth walk in wearing a lab report. Vivian sees Eli now, but not alone. Boundaries are not revenge. They are fences around peace. She follows the rules because she knows access to love is not ownership of it. Sometimes she watches me with an expression I cannot fully read. Regret, maybe, or resentment wearing better clothes. It no longer matters. Preston is a name we rarely say. Margaret sends birthday cards with careful handwriting and too many apologies tucked between the lines. Caleb keeps Howard's letter in his desk. I keep my mother's interview clips saved on my phone. Sometimes when I feel small, I watch her say, "My daughter was working when those people were still deciding which spoon to use." It makes me laugh every time. The gold digger story died slowly. Not because everyone became kind. People love ugly stories, especially about women who marry into wealth. But another story replaced it. The story of a nurse who agreed to the test. The story of a baby who was exactly who his mother said he was. The story of a powerful family exposed by the weapon they aimed at someone else. That is how truth works sometimes. Quiet for years, mocked, doubted, cornered, then suddenly undeniable. If you ask Vivian, she might say the DNA test ruined the family. If you ask Preston, he might say Caleb betrayed him. If you ask society, it might turn the whole thing into scandal. But if you ask me, I will tell you what really happened. A family built on appearances tried to shame a woman for wanting money she never asked for. They questioned a child to protect a fortune. They demanded blood. And when the blood answered, it did not say what they expected. My name is Nora Ellis Hart. I was 29 when they called me a gold digger. I was 29 when they questioned my son. I was 29 when I learned that sometimes the test people demand to expose you becomes the mirror they cannot escape. And years later, when I look at my husband, my son, my mother, and the life we protected, I do not feel like a woman who married into wealth. I feel like a woman who walked into a room full of people determined to reduce her to hunger, held her child against her heart, and refused to bow. They wanted the DNA test to prove I did not belong. Instead, it proved I had been telling the truth from the beginning. And it proved something even better. The people guarding the family name were the ones who had been lying under it. Stop,